is that in Agile, project initiation lies at a level of detail that is explored as we go through the iteration or as we go through the sprint. So we don't necessarily do a whole bunch of pre-research and pre-analysis and then start the sprint. Because the Agile approach is designed to be tolerant of change, the lean principles of just enough and just in time are very much applied here. So you do just enough just enough planning to get you to the next day, or just enough analysis or diagramming to get you to the next day. And this is going to be true of our use cases as well, and you'll see that as we go through the 4 easy steps. As we go through our project iterations, you can see that the development and the development of the product or solution increments through each cycle. Each day, we like to have what we call stand-up meetings, and there's 3 questions that we like to ask. What value did you bring to the project yesterday? What value do you plan to bring to the project today? And what impediments or what roadblocks are in your way that are preventing you from achieving your success? And that, if you're the project manager or the scrum master or whomever you happen to be, that's where you spend your entire day removing those roadblocks. And I believe that's where a business analyst can really come into play. It's my opinion that the ideal role for a BA in any kind of Agile environment is really being that person that removes the roadblocks, getting out there, talking to the people that need to be spoken to, making the calls that need to be made, doing anything that needs to get done so that the designers, developers, and testers can continue working. As we continue on, you'll see in this animation that we release something of value every 2 to 6 weeks. Now, if it's an 8-week cycle, then it's an 8-week cycle. But every cycle, something usable for the customer gets released. And this is a core tenet or core principle of any Agile process. And this will be true of our use cases as well. A guide to the project management body of knowledge, PMBOK Guide, 5th edition, Project Management Institute 2013, does not specify the level of detail that is needed during project initiation. It simply just states that you need to complete some very basic initiation steps. And that's very true of any kind of Agile process as well. The other thing I want to talk about here is something I like to call the psychological importance of Agile. In an Agile environment, we want to foster a few very fundamental ideas: thinking clearly and adapting quickly to customers' needs, collaborating realistically, working in a more meaningful environment, share statuses, have transparency for those statuses, staying focused, of course, being very realistic with respect to our capabilities. For example, if you are incapable or not comfortable creating a very detailed diagram that needs to be created so that a developer can understand something, then that's not something that you would take on as an activity. And then last, we want to adapt quickly. So we love change, and if you don't love change, don't be in an Agile environment. So while use cases are a great tool for the Agile environment, it's important to remember that they're just that, a tool. Without these cultural considerations, not even the best tools are going to help you to succeed. Now, when it comes to the actual use cases themselves, this is where I put them, right here above the user stories, or rather right in place of the user stories. And this may or may not be agreeable to some of the people on the phone, and that's okay. But as we go through, you'll see that the use cases don't replace user stories. It's just a different tool. And when we're doing estimates, I will use use case points. Since we're already doing use cases, I will do use case points, which will help me to create a more meaningful and an adaptive understanding of the unit of time that's required on a use case by use case basis. I think this is a great time for a poll question as we're getting started and as we're really getting into this. Our first poll question reads, please indicate how strongly you agree with the following statement. Business analysis and project managers must have a competent level of understanding regarding the human psychology to be truly effective And what I mean by this is, in order to be really successful as a business analyst or project manager, you have to at least have a basic understanding of human psychology. I will now pass it over.
Sorry, Perry, we've launched the poll. We're just waiting for everyone to have a chance to answer. We have strongly agree, agree, somewhat disagree, disagree, and strongly disagree. So we'll just give it a couple more seconds to give everyone a chance, and I'll bring up the results. All right. So everyone should see the results here. Perry, what do you think? We have strongly agree and agree as our top two answers.
Well, that's good. That's a great relief to me. I was hoping that agree and strongly agree would be reversed. Coming from a psychology background myself, industrial psychology to be more precise, I really pay attention to the social aspect of project management and business analysis. And to me, it's really just a pattern-seeking, storytelling, social collaboration. At the end of the day, it's just people working with people. So I find this very interesting.
All right. Let me go ahead and close that, and over back to you.
Thank you very much. So let's get into the basic principles of Agile. Now, this is just a 1-hour presentation, so I really don't have a lot of time to get into all the details of Agile, but we'll get into some of them. Principles are fundamental behaviors or a chain of reasoning that forms a belief system. While it's important to remember that an Agile approach is a type of process, it's more important to remember that these principles must be considered over and above any process that you adopt. So it's not about, of course there's a process because we are pattern-seeking people, so we need to have some sort of procedural step to go through, but that procedural step is secondary to the principles themselves. Except for the most incredibly simple systems, it's massively difficult to think of every feature for every piece of data and every possible use case for software solutions. That means that a collaborative process with your customer is essential. A lot's discovered through that collaborative process. Also, the world changes pretty fast. Business needs and priorities can shift, through the months or even days, and it can take a large system to. Let me try that again. It can sometimes take months or years for a large system to be built, and what was true 3 or 4 months ago isn't true now. And I know that's a sore spot for a lot of business analysts and project managers out there, but that's just the way it is. And we have to adapt to that. Since the time when the Agile Manifesto was first drafted, Agile has really grown in popularity, and it's almost been institutionalized in a lot of different organizations. It's become sort of an extended project process over top of the things that people are already doing, and this is where people, I think, are missing out on the cultural aspects of Agile. Using use cases can help us because it gives us a level of comfort. And I think the issue here is that people tell us that if we're doing Agile, we have to talk about user stories and epics and themes and so forth, and then collaborate and go build. And it doesn't really give us, and that's pretty much all it tells us, and it doesn't really give us a lot of structure. And the nice thing about using use cases, if you keep them Agile, you keep them short, it gives you just enough structure to have a comfort level, especially if you're coming out of a highly structural waterfall type environment. And if it's not clear to you yet, it soon will be. Let's go through a couple of these principles before we move on. So individuals and interactions over process and tools. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. Now, you'll see at the bottom here, and this is a quote from the Agile group, that is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. So it's not to say that they're going to ignore a plan, but they're going to favor responding to change over the plan itself. So now that I've said that, I want to bring us right into another poll question. Use cases are a useful tool in an Agile environment.
Okay, we've launched the poll. So we have the same 5 answers: strongly agree, agree, somewhat disagree, disagree, and strongly disagree. We'll just give everyone a moment to vote. And I will remind everyone that if you do want to ask a question that Perry will address at the end of the session, please just use the questions pane located at the bottom of your GoToWebinar platform. All right. Close this and let me share the results. All right, everyone should be seeing the results on their screen. Strongly agree and agree are top 2 at 62 and 26%, and somewhat disagree at 11%. Is that surprising, Perry?
A little bit, actually. I was thinking that I would get some disagreeers. So it's nice to see that I already have people who believe in this idea in the first place. But I hope that by the end of this hour, I'll get some of that 62% up and strongly agree. So we'll see how that goes. Thank you for showing me that.
All right, and back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to talk about keeping your use cases agile in my 4 easy steps. Agile project teams plan at the beginning of each iteration. We know that. But what happens is the plans are short, they're fast, and they change. Each iteration at the project level of detail, at the beginning of each iteration, the level of detail is only necessary to get us to the next level or the next stage of the project. Because these iterations are typically only a few weeks long, a detailed plan isn't really easy to produce, nor is it really necessary. But it is likely to be, only somewhat accurate, and it's for this reason why we need to have that regular collaboration. Planning is then becomes sort of a regular activity on an Agile project. It's just something we're constantly doing. Thus the need for, somebody you might call a Scrum Master, for example, and it's their job to keep the plan moving and constantly make changes to it so that the Agile team can just continue producing. So this just-in-time concept, as I mentioned earlier, is needed because the actual work of building a product increment can only be done effectively if the team has a good plan. The most usual part of this planning is that it's done by the project team as a team, as opposed to the manager, him or herself. And this is very much a unique thing when it comes to an Agile environment. Traditional project management has us accepting a plan from the project manager, although that's not something I would prescribe to in any case. Even if you're in the most traditional waterfall environment, I would always want it to be collaborative. However, when you're working in an Agile environment, engaging the team members in regular planning, this Agile approach ensures that the plans are as realistic as they can be. And so what we do here is when we're using our use cases, the first thing to do is, at the very beginning of your project, is to identify all the different actors. And by actors, basically users. And you have to identify this stuff right at the very beginning so that you can actually start planning out your use cases. So my first major step is to identify all the people that are going to use the solution. And then you start talking to them, and you start identifying sort of the general themes and stories that need to be conquered within the particular project. As you continue, you will start to identify the actual users themselves, and you create what I like to call user cards. Remember, when we're working on a project, the users are the ones who are touching the system, but quite often we also need to talk to other stakeholders because they receive value from what the users do. Sometimes you have a user who's just simply inputting data, and it's that data that has value to somebody else, and that's the person we need to talk to, so that they can actually make use of that data and then create value for whatever it is that they have to do. And I find this a lot, not just in an Agile environment, but also in any project. We focus on the users, and we forget that there's a whole bunch of stakeholders out there that have to make sense of the information that gets stored in whatever solution we're creating. If we leave those people out, then we're missing out on a huge stakeholder group. Now, once you get a sense of who it is that you have to talk to, you want to start diagramming your use cases quite quickly. And you'll notice here that I read, do not spend a lot of time modeling. So we're not talking about very complex use case diagrams that you might see in UML, for example, or that you might see in some other use case course where we're teaching you about how to use extends and inherits and all sorts of crazy modeling tools. These are just simple sticks and lines and ellipses, and keep it simple. Verbs and nouns and stick people. And we want to keep it very simple. And the idea here is just simply just associate processes that need to get done and who's doing them. So create these very simple, very effective use case diagrams, keep them fluid and keep them fast. And then when you actually start writing your use cases, you write on demand. So we don't start writing our use cases wholesale. We actually start writing the use cases that we need to write when we need to write them. So this is in keeping with the just-in-time concept. Last, we adapt to a level of precision, and if we need to go into more detail, we do so. But we're only doing that as a point of understanding, and as a point of planning, and as a point for developers and testers and so forth. If they require more information, then we'll give them more information. Before I move on, I think it's probably a good idea that we go through what some of these concepts are, just in case you're not familiar with them. Let's start with a theme. So in the Agile world, now there's a lot of debate sometimes about what these words mean. They don't really have any particular sort of ISO certified terminology, but generally speaking, most people tend to agree that a theme is a top-level objective. Now, it might span many projects, or it might span many products or services, or it might just be for that one project. So you might call this your goal, or your vision, or something like that. Every new method has to have its own terminology. So the Agile methods are mainly distinguished by a unique life cycle. It's an iterative, or a loop, and each life cycle may continue to develop the same theme. It depends on how large the theme is. The flexibility of this Agile approach allows you to move from one theme to the next if you have multiple projects going on. So you could have one Agile team that's dedicated to one theme and one theme only, and then you have another Agile team that's working on two themes simultaneously. What's an epic? That's our next level. An epic is, for all intents and purposes, a group of related user stories. The closest relationship in my mind between a use case and an epic is really a folder, if you will. So if we call an epic a grouping of related user stories, we have an analogy that we could use in UML, and that's called the use case folder, or just simply a folder. So we group our use cases together in something called an epic or a folder. Call it whatever you want. It doesn't really matter what we call it, as long as we understand what it is and how we're going to use it. So what's a user story then? Well, a lot of people know what a user story is, but just in case you don't, I'll take you through it. So a user story is sort of the guts, if you will, of Agile. And this is where we spend our time breaking it apart into something that can actually be codified, tested, and implemented into some solution. User stories must follow, or rather should follow, a concept we call invest. I'll get into that in a little bit. And they have to be testable. They have to be testable. They have to be estimatable, and they have to be small. It has to be something small enough that can actually be done within an iteration. Traditional project management approaches are often called sort of plan-based because they will create all of these requirements or all of these needs up front and then go execute them later on. In an Agile environment, we do have a sense of where we need to go, because we've come up with our epics, themes, and user stories. But when we actually start developing within a particular iteration, those user stories will change and grow and be split off and and so on and so forth. Now, user stories use cases don't replace user stories. It's just another tool. So when we talk about user stories, we have to have three very distinct components of a user story. And that is who the person is. So I, as for example, client service agent, what they need and why they need it. And those are the three basic components of a user story. So as a client care agent, I need to have access to all the transactions that my client has had across all of our lines of business, so that when they call in, I can service them more easily and more quickly and find out their issue and resolve their issue within a timely manner. So that might be a user story. And really, what we're talking about here is building perhaps some sort of form or screen or something like that, where the user can pull up a customer's ID and see all the different things the customer has done within the entire history of them engaged within that particular organization. How will that look? How will that work? Well, that's what we do. That's what we find out when we're actually building a sprint, when we're actually building an iteration, and we actually plan out precisely how that's going to be released. And that's where that collaborative process comes into place. So what I want to do in this particular instance is take these epics and user stories and actually replace them with use cases and use case folders. So a use case, let's just define that first. A use case, as you know, or hopefully as you should know, is a process modeling technique that businesses use to identify what parts of the business they want to select for automation. When we say use case, we mean systems use case. When we say use case, we mean a diagram. This is a UML tool, and UML tools are diagrams. They're not written textual documents. If you want to specify a textual document, then you would say the use case specifications document or the use case description or something like that. But when you say use case, typically what you mean is you're talking about the diagram and you're talking about a systems use case. And a systems use case is a dialogue between a user and a system and the transactions that happen therein. A business use case, and I only mention this once, a business use case is simply just a dialogue that omits the system and just focuses on the process itself. But we're not going to create business use cases in this Agile world. We're going to focus on our systems use case diagrams. So we know that every ellipse that we draw and every stick figure that we associate to that ellipse has points of automation. And what we need to do is figure out what those points of automation are and how best to codify them and test them, and then of course release them for our clients. We like to express our use cases as verbs and nouns. So add new clients, remove clients, suspend clients, withdraw funds, transfer funds. These are all very familiar. The more familiar you get with use cases, the more you'll see them around you. In fact, when you go to pay for something, you'll see a use case running. And if something goes wrong, you'll see an exception. And in that exception, if they have a way to handle it, it'll go fairly smoothly. But if the person whom you're dealing with starts fumbling around and they don't really have a way to deal with it, then that's when you're going to see that the exception wasn't thought of when that particular use case was written out. And it's kind of fun, actually. I do that all the time. It's kind of fun seeing use cases that were written well and use cases that were not written well, or probably a use case that was never written in the first place, which is why the exceptions, when you run into them, don't go so well. Although use cases were originally designed for new system development, they can also be used for existing systems too. Now keep in mind, however, the existing system has to be structured in a particular way. Use cases work really, really well for object-oriented solutions, not as well for structured, sort of procedural, old sort of banking systems, if you will. So if you're going to use this particular method, just use with caution and understand where use cases can be of an advantage and when they can actually be a deterrent. I'm going to compare use cases to user stories. Now, there is a general consensus among professionals that use cases and user stories are not interchangeable. They are completely different tools. So if we are going to use cases in our Agile environment, we do have to understand that they are not replacing the user stories. We are just simply selecting another tool to use within our use case environment. We are probably still going to use our user stories. And then those user stories are going to create use cases. And so the use case is a more precise version, if you will, of a user story. I actually have a few quotes here that I want to read out to you, and I find them a little bit amusing. So Alistair Cockburn, for those of you who may be familiar with that name, has a very amusing quote. Those of you who are not familiar with Alistair, look him up. He's one of the, I guess, our founding fathers, if you will, of the work that we do with use cases. So his quote is, "A user story is to a use case as a gazelle is to a gazebo." I find that quite amusing. Extremeprogramming.org, they tell us that user stories serve the same purpose as use cases, but are not the same. And Mike Cohen, he tells us that user stories just simply aren't use cases. And that's true, they're not. But they're useful, and we can use them. We just have to know how. And that's what I'm going to help you with. So before we move forward, I want to bring us into another poll question. And in this question, what I would like you to answer for me is, using a more agile approach, regardless of which method used, will never be effective in my organization.
All right, so we've launched the poll. Same answers: strongly agree, agree, somewhat disagree, disagree, and strongly disagree. All right, we'll just give everyone a second to place their vote. And I just want to remind everyone that we will be sending a recording of the webinar to everyone that did register for today's session. All right, we'll go ahead and share these results. All right. So Perry, you should be seeing these results on your screen there. Strongly disagree, disagree, somewhat disagree, all pretty much even. Those are our most popular answers. Is this what you expected?
No, actually, I thought agree would take the lead. I've literally instructed thousands of people over the years. I've worked in an Agile environment I've had a lot of projects in Agile, and I'm quite comfortable with it. But I tend to get a lot of students who tell me that their organizations have tried it, it doesn't work, nobody knows what they're doing, they don't understand that it's about culture, they think it's a process they could just simply implement. And I get a lot of people who are just poo-poo the whole thing because they see it and they like it, they just don't understand how it's going to work in their environment. So for people I guess we've got people sitting on the fence here, I guess, is a somewhat disagree. So there is some hope. That's what I'm taking from this. There's some hope out there. So hopefully I can turn a few heads today.
All right. Back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so the slide that you're looking at now is a diagram. Now, you may find some of these diagrams a little bit hard to read, and I'll take you through it. But the idea here is kind of a level of diagramming that you might go through in a typical project, especially if you're leaning towards UML, or if you're working in a use case environment, object-oriented environment, that sort of thing. The reason I have this slide here is because I want to talk to you about how deeply you would go and when you would use these particular things and when you wouldn't use them. At the very, very top, you see a use case folder, and then you see a use case diagram. So for me, the use case folder, I can use that as an epic because that's a grouping of user stories. And for me, I'm going to be using my user stories and my use cases as my core analysis tool, my core elicitation tool. So the use case diagram, I can put many of those diagrams and user stories, if need be, inside those folders. So that's the level that I'm going to spend most of my time. And as you can see, I call that sort of a conceptual level of analysis. It's very high level. And this is where a lot of conversation and a lot of collaboration with your user groups and your customers have to take place in order to actually figure out what's getting built. If we go down to the next level, this is your dynamic analysis. So this is considered the solution in motion. And if you look from left to right, We still have a use case diagram, but it's more robust. And over top of that, we have something called, I'm not sure if a lot of people are familiar with this type of diagram, but it's a great diagram for designers. It's called a sequence diagram. Designers love these. In fact, if I can get away with not doing use case diagrams, I will just move right into the sequence diagram. I find it's a great collaboration tool if you're working with designers. Customers, not so much, because you have to understand how messaging works, how asynchronous messaging works, and synchronous messaging, and objects, and so on and so forth. But this tool, a sequence diagram, if you're not familiar with it, look it up. It speaks directly to your designers. They love it. You'll notice at the far right we have a simple process diagram, or in UML we call it an activity diagram. And this is great for customers too. Designers like them as well because it does talk about the procedural steps. And it's basically just a pictorial version of a use case. And I use these a lot in Agile. In fact, typically what I'll do is, draw a quick ellipse, put a verb noun phrase in it, and then move right into the process diagram and just diagram the whole thing out very quickly. And then from there, we actually start to figure out what the different code would be for each of those procedural steps. In the middle, you'll see at the top, there's something that we're going to take a look at more closely. It's called a use case brief, or use case card, as I like to call it. And then the one sort of just plopped in the center with the blue line of text, that's your use case detailed document, your use case specifications document. So in an Agile environment, I would not create that one. I would not write out a use case specifications document in detail. I would create a sequence diagram for my designers if need be. I would create a process diagram and a use case diagram for my customers if need be to help them understand all the different processes that are going on within the solution. And that's about it. That's as deep as I would go. So we want to go to the first layer for our planning and the second layer for our analysis and elicitation during the sprint itself. That's it. The last layer, which is our structure of the structure of the solution itself, the actual collaboration that's going on between the different nodes within the solution. In fact, that's what the center diagram is. The far left, we have a class diagram that actually speaks to the attributes and the different processes that the classes can actually do. Now, these particular diagrams are useful for designers in a more traditional waterfall environment, but really they add a lot of time and they add a lot of structure to our project, which is something we're trying to avoid in a typical Agile type environment. Now herein lies the rub. You don't create these diagrams and then later on somebody needs them as a reference and they're not there. Well, here's the thing in Agile. Nobody said that we don't do diagramming. In fact, we do. We do a lot of it. We just only do the ones we need to do. So for example, if we need to do a class diagram, then we'll do it. But if we don't need to do a collaboration diagram or an object diagram or whatever other kind of diagram somebody wants us to make, if it's just not needed, if it's not adding value to the project, then we will not do it. And so you need to be very discretionary about which diagrams you create and which ones you don't, because obviously each one has time. When you're working with your clients and your subject matter experts in sort of a heterogeneous environment, this is where you have different knowledge bases, different people with different expertise, and so on and so forth, and you're trying to collaboratively solve these business needs, a lot of people don't necessarily have knowledge of some of these detailed diagrams. And if the designers start creating these things on whiteboards, you can lose your customer very quickly. So I like to try to keep things simple. And if my designers want to create these kind of diagrams for themselves, for their own understanding, then by all means do so. But just make sure that you can get your stuff delivered when I ask you to deliver it. So we're going to go through how we can actually convert our user stories into use cases. So in this particular example, I'm showing you a theme. And in this theme, I have different epics. And I'm going to go through, and I'll just show you what the epics are. We don't necessarily need to read them out. But this one theme creates 3 epics. Obviously, there'll be more. But if we want to increase traffic to the IIBA website, we might want to add a video section or improve registration process or add a user form or something like that. And so these are just things we might want to do. And that's pretty much an epic for me, things we might want to do. Now, we might create some user stories from there. You know, as a chapter member, I want to see monthly presentations, yada, yada, yada. So, and that's typically how we go through this when we're doing something Agile-oriented. And then from there, we create some tasks, and we put the tasks on the board, and then we do the tasks. And that's pretty much how it goes. So now, if we actually want to convert this into something more use case-oriented, what we do now is the theme remains the same. The epics more or less remain the same, but we can think of those as use case folders. But now what we do is we can actually create these folders, and here are some examples here, add user form, improve registration process, and so forth. And then what the cool thing is we can actually start to create use cases out of these user stories. And so from those user stories, so just let me go back a second. So as a chapter member, I want to see monthly presentations. So I can just simply create a use case that reads, view monthly presentations. And then I can actually create a use case brief from that. And if you look at this use case brief, this is what I call a use case brief or card. Basically what it's showing you, and I know this example is not what I was just mentioning, but basically what it's showing you is a high-level use case. Just the basic input-output. We're not going into a lot of detail. In fact, the alternates aren't even flushed out in terms of steps, nor the exceptions. But what it is showing you is a great tool that you can use to flush out the collaboration, flush out any other detailed diagrams that need to be discovered in order to actually create this as a working solution. So this right here, what you're looking at right here for me is, I guess, the core of it. So this is what we use for planning. This is what we use for design. This is what we use for development. And in traditional use case modeling, this becomes a very iterative process, as it does here as well. We take this thing, we put it on the board, we create activities out of it. If we need any more diagrams, we do that. And that becomes the genius of using use cases in an Agile environment. This thing right here, this use case card or brief. And this is as far as we take it. We don't write out the use case in detail. Anything that needs to be done from here is part of that collaborative process. Another poll question, and we can just cover this very quickly. If your organization is already moving towards Agile, from the choices listed below, which do you feel reflects the strongest obstacle that's standing in your way to fully adapting an Agile environment?
All right, so we have 5 choices: management, team interest, customer interest, learning curve, and time constraints. All right, so we'll just give everyone a moment. And I will remind everyone that we will have time for a few questions at the end. If you do have a question, please type it into the questions pane. All right. We still have a few more people thinking about this, so we'll just give everyone a few more seconds. All right. And I'll go ahead and share the results. All right. Perry, we have learning curve, followed by time constraints and management.
That is exactly what I expected to see. When I show this, and this is not the first time I've had this conversation with people, when I talk about this with people, that's the constant feedback that I get is there's a learning curve and we don't have time to learn this. We have to just do it. And you know, unfortunately, with anything new, there is a bit of a learning curve. But I promise you, this is something that we can get through in a day. Now, I know we're just talking about this for an hour, and I'm going through very quickly a lot of information that would typically cover, say, in a workshop, for example. I would cover this over an entire day, and we'd go through it step by step by step with the exercises. And by the time you got out of the workshop, you have actually done an iteration, at least theoretically. So you could actually go to work and you could actually start doing it. Although I know the learning curve seems a little bit daunting, it's not. I've been doing this for years, and I promise you this is something that we could handle within a day easily.
All right. So back to you.
Thanks. The last thing I wanted to show you before we wrap up is slicing and dicing your use case. Now this is the last most important thing that you need to know. So if you take anything away from this, you take two things. One, the use case brief, and that's your planning tool. That's your working tool to actually produce something. And the last thing you take from this is this slide right here, this nice pretty little slide, which represents the different bits of the use case. You don't put that use case card through wholesale one shot. And that's things that we used to do back in the old days of waterfall when we were trying to adopt use cases. We assumed that we had to put the whole use case through in one release, and that's not true. You don't have to do that. Use cases have always been agile, and I think that's been forgotten over the years. So in my example here, I have 4 releases, and each color corresponds to a release. And you'll notice, I'll just go through 2 of them. The top left-hand corner, we have 3 releases, 1, 2, and 4. So half the use case will not be released until the second iteration, phase, whatever you want to call it. We're going to release a quarter of it in the first release, and then we don't release the last quarter until the very final release of our particular project or solution or whatever it is we're working on. What represents a slice? A slice is represented by a scenario. This isn't something that we have a lot of time to go into because it's just a short workshop, or sorry, a short webinar. We cover that obviously in a workshop, where one particular scenario is a complete path-through use case. And we determine how many transactions, again, that's something we cover in a workshop, how many transactions the use case has, and that helps us to figure out how much of it we can actually get through in a particular release. And that's the last thing I wanted to show you for today. I think I have one more poll question. Now that you've seen this presentation, what I'd like you to indicate for me is, do you think, and I know you probably haven't seen enough, you'd have to go through a workshop really to understand this fully, but do you think you've seen enough to tell me that you could use use cases in an agile environment?
All right, we'll give everyone a moment to ponder that. I will invite you to ask any questions using the questions pane. If we don't have time to get to your question, we will follow up with you after the webinar, so not to worry about that. And we will be sending out a recording of the webinar to everybody that has registered. All right, so let's see if we've changed some minds. All right. So we have strongly agree at 31, agree at 58, and somewhat disagree at 8. So we've moved some people today, Perry.
Yeah, not as much as I hoped, but like I said, you know, we flew through this, right? This is just 1/8, literally 1/8 of what I would cover in a full day workshop. So I'm glad to see that we have moved some people. I'm very glad to see that.
All right, great. Back to you.
Okay. Well, that's it for me. I just wanted to thank everybody for taking their time out of their busy day. I know I said this at the beginning. You know, we all have a lot of stuff to deliver, and I want to thank you. I know it's important for a lot of people to try to come up with better ways to get their work done. And as an educator, this is something I strongly believe in, and I think that this is something that could work. If you're more interested, if you actually do want to learn more, go to our website, just like Global Knowledge Canada, and if you just go to the search, it's at the top right-hand corner, I think, and type in 2132, and you'll actually get this. You'll actually see this course, this workshop, and all the things that I cover in the entire day. And like I said, this is literally just 1/8 of what we cover. And by the end of the day, you've actually done a use case brief, and you have put it through an iteration. You have actually gone through the slices, and you've actually used use case points to calculate how long it would take to do that use case brief.
All right, great, Perry. We do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
What if use cases often involve more work than can fit into 1 2-week iteration?
Well, that's where the slices come into play. The important thing is to understand breaking up the use case into digestible chunks. It's that whole thing, never bite off more than you could chew. And this only really comes with practice. Use case points can help us, something I didn't have a chance to go in, I apologize. But what it does is it focuses on the transactions. And the transaction is a round trip between a user and the system and then back to the user again. I made a mistake. I just want to correct something. I misspoke earlier when I said that we look at a scenario as a use case slice. And that's true. We can look at an entire scenario, but we can actually look at transactions too. Say, for example, we have a transaction that we can put through easily, but the entire scenario would take too long. So we might put through a bit of that transaction through that iteration and then do the rest of the scenario through the next iteration. That is not preferred because the idea is to actually get an entire scenario out so that it is something that can be used by the particular user, something that is of value. So if you have parts of your use case that can't go through on their own, you're going to have to come up with creative ways to slice them up so that you can get through what you need to get through in a particular iteration. And remember, you're not doing all your use cases at once. They're being staggered. And they have to be modular, so you don't want to have a bunch of use cases that are dependent upon each other. They should more or less stand on their own. Again, that's something I cover in more detail in the workshop. Do you have another question?
Yep. Does an inclusion use case have its own use case slices?
That's a really good question. That's actually a really technical question. I mentioned that we try to stay away from complex use case modeling, but included use cases are a big part of object-oriented analysis, and we find that we have, for those of you who don't know, an included use case is embedded functionality. So we'll say that you have update profile or update bank statement or something like that, and you use that same bit of functionality over and over and over again. Well, obviously it makes sense that you would externalize that functionality and create its own use case, and we call that an included use case. So inclusion means that we move behavior from one use case to another. We literally cut and paste text between the two use case narratives. However, this does not mean that we move complete stories or use case slices. This is because an inclusion use case is never performed on its own. So to answer the question succinctly, the first use case that uses that inclusion will have to be developed for that particular scenario so that when that scenario is released, it can actually use that inclusion bit of functionality. So if, for example, in scenario 2, you have the included part, that's when you would develop the included part. If scenario 1 doesn't have the included part, you wouldn't develop the included part until you had to. So remember, it's just in time. Next question?
Yeah, we do have another one. Perry, this is a culture shift, and how do people impress this upon their managers in their own workplaces?
Wow. That's a really tough question. Culture shifts have to come from management. They really do. I've heard of the idea of grassroots culture shifting and so forth, but it doesn't work unless you have management approval, unless you have management support. Think about your own family life. If you have a type of family life where your parents are very supportive of the things that you do, then you'll be very successful. But if you have a family life where your parents are not supportive of the things that you do, there's all sorts of controversy and arguments and combative nature and so forth. And the same applies here. So the first thing that we need to do in order to get management support, my suggestion actually, is to convince them to allow you to work on a project that is of lower significance, lower importance, lower cost, lower value, perhaps fewer people need to be involved, and almost do it as a design of experiments. And we're all analysts here, so we all know how to track information, and what you do is you track everything. And at the end, you show the value of what you did. And you say, look, we did this, and here's what our outcome was. We had fewer, in fact, we had 57% fewer bugs than we do on average. We produced the product, all things being equal, we produced the product 20% faster than we do on average, yada, yada, yada. So you actually come up with a high-level report that you can actually show management to say, look, this works, and I can prove it to you. And if you could provide that kind of information, then I think you can actually create a business case.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Perry. We are out of time now. I want to thank you for a really interesting presentation, and I want to thank everyone that attended the webinar. We will be sending out a recording, and if you do have any other questions, please respond to that email, and we will get you answers as soon as possible. Thank you again, Perry.
Thanks. Thanks for your time, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, and now the webinar has now closed.